In January, Governor Brown projected another big surplus over what was projected in last June's state budget package. But the governor's warning that financial clouds may be forming. Should the surplus be saved, spent on new programs, or used to pay down the state's debts? What are the governor's budget priorities? And what do budget reform groups think of the budget process generally and the governor's budget in particular? We'll ask Mac Taylor, leader of California's Nonpartisan Legislative Analyst Office, or LAO, the authoritative voice on the state's fiscal matters, and Fred Silva, the senior fiscal policy advisor of California Forward, one of the state's most respected reform groups. The governor's 2016 budget. Sunny today, rain tomorrow?
Additional funding for the Maddy Report made possible by a grant from The Wonderful Company, harvesting health and happiness around the world, and by Kaiser Permanente. Thrive. From the California Channel at the State Capitol and the Maddy Institute, it's the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. In January, the governor presented his 2016-17 budget proposal to the legislature. What are the governor's priorities? And will the state have revenues to pay for its short and long-term expenses? Our guest is Mac Taylor, California's legislative analyst and the authoritative source for a nonpartisan analysis of the state budget. Welcome back to the Maddy Report.
Thank you, Mark. Nice to be back.
So what's your overall impression of the governor's budget?
Well, first of all, things have been going very well for the state economically, driven by the Bay Area in particular. The state's economy has been doing very well. State revenues have been doing very well. The governor's budget reflects that. There's lots of new money, and the governor takes a cautious approach. I think he expressed his concern about what happens if the economy heads south and revenues head south in the near future. So what he's done is put a lot of money away in reserves and spent a lot of what he does spend, it's on one-time purposes so that you don't have that spending that would be ongoing.
Those ongoing expenses that really cause a problem in the budget in down years.
Can cause a problem, yes.
You know, this is not the first time we've seen an increase in revenue over initial projections. What is driving these new higher revenue projections?
Well, the governor did come up quite a bit, say for in this current year that we're in now, the 15-16 fiscal year. He came up over $3 billion from what he had assumed back when the budget was passed last June. Now, this is about the number where we were at last June, so we didn't think much had changed. And in fact, I think the governor just had to recognize that cash was coming in a lot better than what they had estimated, so they increased their numbers.
Yeah, and truth be told, if you take a look at the LAO's reports, typically you're closer to the numbers in the final analysis. It seems like you're a little closer.
Well, I think in recent years that's the case. Not always been the case in the past, but in recent years I think we've done probably a little better job of nailing the capital gains related monies.
I was trying to give you a shout out.
Well, I appreciate it.
Anyway, you know, you've been talking about, you're hearing other people talk about this issue of revenue deterioration, much of it tied to stock market volatility. Can you explain that connection?
Well, we had actually used that term in a blog post that we had just a little while ago, and it was based on the money that came in January. That can be a big month for personal income taxes because high income taxpayers are making their last estimated payment for 2015. And the money didn't come in quite as well as we had all assumed. And that, coupled with what happened in January in the stock market, that was the reason we sort of put out a caution that, hey, at least we're now seeing some signs, not that things might be better once we get to May and June and closing out the budget, they could be a little bit worse.
You know, are there other economic conditions other than just say stock prices that could change the state's revenue forecasts yet again?
Oh, well, of course. I mean, we're closely tied with the national economy, so should that slow down more than we had predicted, that would affect our revenues. Obviously, events in China and Asia, we've built in what's happening there, but if it were worse than what we had estimated, revenues could go down. If the market were to take another correction downward, all of those things could affect our revenues, especially when you look forward, you know, almost 18 months of what happens before the end of the year.
Yeah, projections, that can't be easy. You're trying to, you know, the further you go out, the more difficult it is.
Absolutely. In fact, you know, we feel somewhat confident in making projections, say, for the coming budget year. Beyond that is a little bit of a crapshoot.
It's like the family budget. I can deal with it for this year, but maybe not 2 or 3 years down the line. You know, the governor's putting a lot of emphasis on reserves. So what is he doing to increase the state's reserves?
Well, there's a couple of things going on. First of all, when people passed Proposition 2 a couple of years ago.
Which is the rainy day fund.
The rainy day fund, it requires certain amounts of money. So based on Proposition 2, the reserves would grow by about just over $2.5 billion. What the governor then did is, in addition to that amount, he puts in over $3 billion more into various state reserves.
More than double.
More than double of just what is required in the coming year.
Right.
And that results in a total reserves of about 9%, which is the highest that I can remember. 9% of our general fund revenue.
I think a lot of companies would like to have a 9 or 10% reserve. That sounds pretty good.
Well, I think in general you'd say that that sounds good. Just have to remember that our revenue structure in this state is very volatile.
That's true.
It can go up and down rather quickly. So 9% might think, it seems like a lot, but we can lose that very quickly.
You know, it's interesting you make that point because a number of years ago when we spoke, you said that you were projecting $20 billion deficits as far as the eye could see. The total amount here is going to be about, what, $10 billion in reserve?
Exactly.
So that would get you 6 months in a downturn.
Now again, back then we were talking about the effects of the Great Recession, which was rather extreme. So a 9 or 10% reserve could go a long ways towards buying you time to help you to adjust to any economic slowdown.
That kind of begs the question, what is the appropriate number for a reserve? Should it be 5%, 10% more?
Well, there's no right number. What we have told the legislature, pick a robust number. And I realize that's a little bit vague, but I think we were trying to suggest to them, you need a large reserve.
Right.
And whether the governors, we consider that a fairly robust number, or you want to be even more. The Proposition 2 set a 10% cap or a limit on reserves, and that's certainly a very reasonable level to shoot for, particularly given where we are in terms of the economic recovery. We're towards the tail end, historically speaking.
Right. You know, the governor's been talking a lot about, has in the past, about this wall of debt. And I'm just wondering, has he allocated anything in the budget to pay down the state's debt?
Yeah. First of all, I think it's important to distinguish on the wall of debt, the governor, I think, was referring mainly to budgetary related debt. That is, things we did in the short term to help address the severe budgetary problems we faced in the Great Recession. So it doesn't deal with like larger debts of pensions and state retiree health benefits and things like that. But on the budgetary, the wall of debt, as he called it, we've been paying down an awful lot of that. It was probably $35 billion or something like that. And we've paid all but about $9 billion of it. He does commit about $1.5 billion in the coming budget towards sort of working those things down.
It's not glamorous, but it's probably fiscally prudent. Let me ask you about this. We've talked in the past about ballot box budgeting, where you have these propositions like Prop 2, the Rainy Day Fund, or Prop 98, the Minimum Education Funding Guarantee. What impact does that have on state budgeting?
Well, it certainly limits what the legislature and the governor can do, because these things are somewhat automatic. You know, you have to put this much money in the reserve, you have to spend this much money, at least on schools. It's certainly made it more complex, though. Even Proposition 2 and 98, the two items you referenced, they interact in very complicated ways. So it's certainly made it, even for my office, and we know a lot about the budget, it's made it much more complex just to understand what's going on in our fiscal matters.
Yeah, it makes it more difficult. Well, up next, a discussion of how the governor plans to pay for some of those bigger expenses, like education infrastructure. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking about the governor's proposed budget with California's nonpartisan budget expert, Mac Taylor, the state's legislative analyst. Let's talk about some of the state's bigger current ongoing expenses. Education's one. It's the largest part of the budget. This is K through 12 and community college. About 40% of the general fund expenditures, largely driven by formulas, as we discussed. This year, given the improved budget picture, seems to be a significant increase in school funding. How much? And by the way, are there any strings attached to that money?
Schools do very well. When I say schools, like you say, it's both elementary and high schools and the community colleges. Do very well, as they've done for the past 2 or 3 years. They get about $4.3 billion more over not only the budget year, the current year, and the past year, because we have to make these adjustments to Proposition 98 spending. And so that's a large chunk of money. Most of it is ongoing. There is a large chunk, about $1.3 billion, that's one-time in nature. That's given out to schools to spend on whatever sort of one-time things that they want to spend it on. They could do deferred maintenance, they could buy equipment, they could do whatever they want. And the ongoing money is basically strings-free. That is, it's going out under what's called the local control funding formula. And
that funding formula, my understanding is, it's trying to give more money to poor districts. English is a second language, low-income districks?
The formula gives out money sort of equally throughout to districts, but it is based on how many kids you have who are low-income or English learners.
Okay, so there's not really strings attached. So they're given the money, and they could use this on teacher salaries, for example.
Whatever they want. Hire teachers, pay more, whatever they want to do.
Okay. Let's talk about universities, the UC and the CSU. They're getting a 5% increase in the state budget. There's also money to help pay for a $1.1 billion expansion to UC Merced. Essentially, it's going to increase the student population by 75%, up to 10,000 students, and more than double its space by 2020. The governor's premised a lot of this education funding, higher education funding, on no tuition increase. But usually he attaches it to things like metrics, like improved graduation rates or increases in enrollment. Is that happening here, or is this just he's giving them the 5% and do with it what you will?
For the most part, they'll have control over how they spend the monies. There are some exceptions. We do give them, like UC money for their retirement system, that has to go to that. We give them some small amounts for deferred maintenance. They have to spend it on that. But for the most part, they can spend it on whatever they want. Same thing as with schools. They could hire more professors, deal with more enrollment, to kind of do with it what the systems desire.
Mm-hmm. And there's actually negotiations ongoing right now with the CSU faculty, and they're asking for an increase, and who knows what will happen there.
But I think everyone assumes that some would go for compensation for their employees.
Right. So I guess we'll find out. Since I'm a professor, I've got some interest in that. I will admit that. Well, listen, there's also discussion about the state's infrastructure, maintaining roads and schools and jails and state office buildings, things of that nature. Recently, there was a special session by the legislature specifically talking about the deterioration of state highways. What has the governor proposed in this budget for state highway maintenance needs?
Very similar to a plan that he's had out there for several months. He would increase both registration fees of all car drivers, vehicle drivers, and he would increase the gas tax. He would raise about $3.6 billion in total annually that would go for improving and maintaining our highways.
Those vehicle fees get people excited.
Yeah.
My understanding it's about a $65 vehicle fee increase.
That's right.
So, all right, what about public infrastructure? What's the governor doing there to improve it, like state office buildings and things of that nature?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Most of the one-time money is spent on infrastructure. $1.5 billion for some state buildings, and about $800 million for deferred maintenance for assets throughout the state of all types. And so that's quite a bit of money.
What I also noticed in your report where you were talking about county jail construction, $250 million going there.
That's true too.
So
that's part of it.
A lot of money, and needed because of realignment, obviously. You stated in your review that, quote, the governor's attention to infrastructure makes sense, unquote, but you still want the legislature to consider some other things. What and why?
Well, first of all, if you think about one-time spending, it's not just infrastructure. The legislature might want to use some one-time spending to pay down some of its retirement-related debts, for example.
Which are significant.
Which are very significant and carry high sort of costs, interest-like costs associated with them. So first of all, I was just telling him, look, you have other choices between infrastructure and other one-time expenditures. Within infrastructure, you have choices. He's made selections about these 3 state buildings, for example, that he wants to replace. There's lots of other state buildings we could address. There's lots of other state assets. Think about water or levees or all sorts of things that we could think about. Where should we spend that next dollar? So we like his focus on infrastructure. It's just that the legislature has a lot of other choices that it could make.
And you need to look at that. Well, I want to thank Mac Taylor for that discussion on the state budget. Up next, what do government reform groups think of the governor's budget? We'll hear from one of them, one of the more influential groups, Cal Forward, a group focused on the state's fiscal management. That's next on the Maddy Report. Welcome back. California Forward is a bipartisan effort to distill the work of public commissions and private think tanks to come up with specific reforms to improve state government. Our guest is Fred Silva. He's California Forward's Senior Fiscal Policy Advisor and expert in state and local finance. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Thank you, Mark.
So we were talking about reserves earlier. I'm just wondering, from your perspective, how much should the state have in its reserves to prepare for the next economic downturn?
I wish there were a simple answer to that. California Forward, in its early period, did a lot of work looking at best practices of other states. We came to 2 conclusions. One of those conclusions was those states that have volatile revenue sources, where their revenues move up and down.
Sounds like California.
Yes, with the economy, they tended to have larger reserves. They did better when they had larger reserves. Currently, I think our reserve number's up to about 7% of total revenue.
7 to 9%, yeah.
Something like that. And that's a pretty healthy reserve. If the objective is to have a reserve to cushion a downturn. I wish there were a magic number that some states have figured out. There's the number, but there isn't.
Yeah. It depends on the magnitude of the downturn, too, right?
Absolutely.
Because we have a $10 billion surplus reserve now proposed, but we had a time not so long ago we were dealing with $20 billion deficits. So it kind of depends, and that was a very bad recession, of course.
Right, and in that case, it's not that you can get a reserve in order to finance all of an economic downturn, because you can't do that. The objective is to cushion that
the blow.
downturn.
Yeah, cushion the blow. So what about using this excess money to retire some of the state's long-term debts like pensions and retiree health?
You know what? One of the benefits of the current reserve system was actually brought to us by the voters with Prop 2.
The rainy day fund.
Exactly. California Forward was very active in that process, thinking we needed a system that captured spikes in revenue as well as had a continuing deposit that goes into the reserve for two purposes. One of them was to build a cushion for downturn. The other was to take some of that money, some of which is one time, and use it to pay off long-term debt and long-term liabilities, which is what it does.
What about using this excess money to deal with one-time infrastructure projects? You know, instead of putting all the money into reserves, let's take care of some of the things we haven't been taking care of.
Right, and Prop 2 allows you to do that. Particularly when the components of Prop 2, one of those components is to capture a portion of the spike in capital gains, that amount of money that you don't normally get. That amount is what's pulled off to the reserve, half of which can be spent on infrastructure and long-term liability.
Yeah, because those capital gains go up and down, obviously, with the stock market.
Exactly.
Right? And that's one of the problems with California's volatile revenue structure that we've heard before. So if we're taking some of this money and using it for one-time infrastructure projects, how should those projects be prioritized?
Well, you know, that's one
and
of
not politicized.
Yeah, a good question. There are two parts to that. One of them is where that need exists. It exists to a large extent in our regional economies, either in Southern California, the Inland Empire, the Valley, certainly. And it's up to the legislature to appropriate those through a regular public process.
But then politics come in. I mean, one of the issues is, of course, you know, the political power, frankly, is where the population is in Southern California or maybe in the Bay Area. You could make an argument that the needs are in the Valley.
They are indeed a substantial amount of the need. Each of our economic regions has a set of needs. What's important for the legislature is to recognize those needs and to take those resources, again, that are one-time in nature, and apply those to those infrastructure needs that are regionally based. So the legislature ought to listen to the Valley and ask them, what are those infrastructure needs? Now, Proposition 1 of some time ago that provided for the transportation bonds, a significant amount of that money went into the improvement of Highway 99. So that was an example of the state listening to the regions, in that particular case, the Valley.
I think one of the things you sometimes get worried about is when you take some of these spikes in revenue and then create ongoing programs as opposed to one-time deals, because then the program continues, but the revenue doesn't.
Which you want to avoid.
Right. So what's the best way to finance these infrastructure projects? There's lots of ways to do it. You can do a direct appropriation. We could rent or lease the project, or we could borrow through bonds. What's the best approach?
Well, if you think about it, there are users of infrastructure, particularly in water and resource management kinds of infrastructure, where the user ought to have the obligation to help finance that infrastructure. There are other instances, some of them environmental, where there's not a direct nexus or link between the user and the investment. And for those, you use the general economy to do that through general obligation bonds and through the tax system. So I think you first start with who's the beneficiary here.
And then make a decision from there.
Right.
Okay, what do we do about the state's roller coaster revenue situation? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking with Fred Silva from California Forward. He's their senior fiscal policy advisor and expert on state and local finance. You know, we're talking about revenue for the state, and the main source of revenue is personal income taxes. People might be surprised to know that's about 2/3 of the revenue. It's highly volatile. We talked about that with capital gains. So when we see these spikes in revenue, I mean, should we be thinking about new commitments, things we've left off in the past and maybe add to, or should we be resisting that urge and just saying, no, let's just pay off the debts and deal with, you know, one-time infrastructure kind of deals?
I think that what's key here is a sense of fiscal management. And since we are
fiscally prudent.
Yeah, there you go. But we're not interested in attacking the tax structure in order to reduce volatility. What's important is to take volatility out of the spending process through the budget.
The other side of the equation.
Yeah, exactly. We learned in probably the post-World War II period all the way up into the 90s that the model for budgeting was you get what you got in the prior year plus growth. So every nickel, whether it's one time or not, was invested into the program structure. Now, under this domain and this governor, frankly, and legislature, the issue has been what ought we to invest in programs where the economy is growing sufficiently so that it can maintain that investment. And if you've got one-time revenue, that's where that revenue should be invested into infrastructure and paying down liabilities. Prop 2 but we're back to the rainy day fund again, was structured in order to facilitate that.
So I'm gonna let you be the governor. Okay, so let's say we've got these ongoing needs. We know we'd have those, and there's the money there and a willingness to pay for it. Which ongoing needs do you think have the highest priority?
Well, historically, it's been education. It's been investment in human capital. And one of the priorities of California Forward has been to kind of figure out how we should invest better in human capital. That's from K to 12 through higher education.
Well, let's just do K to 12 in community college, and that's over 40% of the state budget right now.
It is. It's about 55% if you include higher ed in it.
Okay, and higher, that's another bucket, right?
And frankly, it has been that way for a very long time. The voters put a constitutional guarantee in the
That's Prop 98.
Yeah, that Prop 98 in 1988. And if you look back before that, we were still spending about that amount. There were times during the Duke Majan administration when there was tension.
So what did Prop 98 do? It just continued what we were already doing?
Well, what it did was it set up a minimum allocation that if the legislature or governor tried to deal with it, they'd have to suspend it, and it would take an action of the legislature to reduce the guarantee.
Sounds like a little distrust there of the politicians.
Absolutely, and that's where the education world comes in and says, we want to force you to, if you need to reduce the guarantee, you need to vote to do that.
Right.
And that's one of the objectives of Prop 98.
Yeah, I want to talk about the Prop 98 with the minimum guarantee for education. You've got Prop 2, the rainy day fund, all these ballot box budgeting things that voters seem to pass. Good idea, bad idea?
You know, we have basic rules that we put in the Constitution. And one of them is our budgeting practice, which went in the Constitution in 1922. We've been doing ballot box budgeting since the 1920s. So I'm not as bothered about ballot box budgeting. The problem with it is that it's so easy to capture resources and to apply them to something. So you take the cigarette, let's raise the cigarette tax and put it over here. Let's raise another tax and put it over there. That's the dilemma in ballot box budgeting. What Prop 98 did was Prop 98 basically said, state, you have a minimum funding level that we want to see in education. So figure out how to do that.
Okay, well, you know, talking about that, you know, we had Prop 30 recently to provide a little more funding for education. That's being phased out. What's going to happen if that goes away? And there's supposed to be a temporary tax. What happens in the post-Prop 30 world in terms of education funding? Well,
what's interesting about this, if you look at the way Prop 30 was constructed, and then arguably the way Prop 2 is constructed, that there's a phase out that's done of Prop 30. And as it phases out, the administration's forecast, as well as the legislative analyst forecast, argues that that fiscal management will cover the difference. Now, whether we get to 2019 and 2020 and the economy is still growing, then they can manage their way through it. If the economy isn't growing, then you've got a case where you need to come in with reserves through Prop 2 to try to manage your way through it.
You know, we've only got about 30 seconds left. I want to ask you kind of a big question, and that is, you know, everybody says that our fiscal structure is kind of, it's volatile. We've talked about that. What would you say is politically viable? What steps could we do to kind of lessen that volatility?
There are two of them. One of them I think has been done in Prop 2, which again took the volatility out of the spending side. And the other is to watch the way in which programs that are themselves volatile, because their caseloads grow, is to manage those in a way that produces results, that focuses on results as opposed to simply the swings of putting money in one year and taking out.
Well, there's your solution. I want to thank Fred Silva, California Forward's Senior Policy Analyst, as well as Mac Taylor, the California Legislative Analyst, for joining us. If you want to stay current with state and local politics, you can follow us on Twitter or Facebook, or log on to our website at maddynst.org and sign up for our free e-newsletter, The Maddy Daily. This is Mark Keppler for The Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the California Channel or the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions expressed on the Maddy Report, visit our website at maddyinstitute.org.